So I played through Diablo IV 3 times. When the game first came out, I played through the campaign normally, and then I did the usual endgame stuff, Hell Tides, Nightmare Dungeons, World Bosses. Then when Season 1 came out, I leveled up a character doing the seasonal stuff. I skipped the campaign, and I did a bunch of seasonal content and got to World Tier 3, and I wasn't too thrilled with that experience. When I decided to make this video, I played through the game a third time as a hardcore seasonal character, but I leveled up through the campaign, and that's sort of my experience of where I'm going to be coming from. I'm going to divide this video into 3 parts. The first part's going to be talking about the campaign and single-player narrative experience. The second part is going to be the mechanics of Diablo IV, and the last part is going to be about seasonal specific stuff and my opinions on it. Alrighty, let's get started.
Then at least have the decency to join me for supper. I'm bloody hungry.
The campaign. I thought the campaign of Diablo IV was fun, good enough characters, reasonable enough plot, and it takes you through a bunch of different locations. You go to these different dungeons and fight some pretty good bosses. And I think overall, something that I really did appreciate was a lot of the voice acting and the cinematics and the special effects. I thought all that was really cool. The mechanical pacing of the campaign, I think, is really good. So you're always kind of doing something new, you're going to a new location, and you're progressing your character up pretty heavily. I didn't have to grind at all until the end of the game. So just doing campaign quests, I got to around level 40, level 41, which I think is great because they kind of want you to be level 50 by the end of the campaign. So I thought overall very good, mechanically paced. I will say the campaign is very World of Warcraft styled. If you haven't played WoW, this isn't going to make too much sense, but if you have, it's really weird. There are these like basically 5 different zones you can go into, and they're like zones from World of Warcraft. They're pretty standalone in what they are, and the zones have this overarching quest line that involves a specific character or two, and you interact with that character in that quest line, and when the quest line is over, you never return to that zone again. And you go on to the next zone with new characters and a new quest line, and eventually all the characters from all the different quest lines meet up, and then you go fight the big bad boss. The overworld isn't that bad, but it isn't that good either. I understand what they're going for. I mean, big overworlds full with a bunch of crap to do is pretty prominent right now in video gaming, and I think that's understandable. I personally am not a big fan of open world games. I don't think Diablo IV suffers too much from it. I think the problem with the overworld is the number of things to do and the quality of those things. An example would be collecting altars of Lilith. There are over 100 of them. It is not fun. It's very boring to gather them, but you want to gather them. It's very objectively correct to collect all of them because they give your characters permanent stats. And that's very valuable. But then they have 50 dungeons per zone, and the dungeons are very middling. You know, I'd rather have a handful of tasks to do in the open world and have them all be good than have a ton of stuff to do and have most of it be middling. Going through the open world without a horse is also pretty bad. You know, I was watching some old footage of Elden Ring, and they give you a horse right away, and I think if you had to play through half of Elden Ring before you got a horse, most people would think that game incredibly dull and boring. And going from 2 characters that had horses to starting a new one for footage, and not having a horse made this open world feel super barren, just incredibly big and not in a good way. When you get a horse, I think the open world is very manageable. As far as the overarching narrative of the campaign goes, it felt very inconclusive. Lilith is the big bad villain of Diablo IV, and she really doesn't feel like it. I mean, people are always talking about her, you see all these cutscenes involving her, but she doesn't have a lot of presence, I feel like. She never really feels like as big as a threat as some other characters like Elias or the angel guy. I truly felt like she was underutilized. They didn't make her as much of a villain as they could have. But I will say her fight's pretty good. In fact, most boss fights in this game I think are pretty good. The story-specific boss fights, I think, 1, look very cool, and 2, feel very unique and different. And the last thing I'll say is the graphics look amazing. I really think this is incredible art direction. I would play so many video games if they looked like Diablo IV. Just absolutely beautiful. And the music is also very good. Big fan. So moving on to mechanics, I realized while playing that Diablo is kind of like the Dynasty Warriors of RPGs. You know, the idea here is that you level up a character, but all of your moves are big and flashy and gigantic, and you just are supposed to be able to slaughter waves and waves of skeletons and demons and stuff. I played 3 different classes. I felt they were all pretty unique. There are 5 classes in Diablo 4 at the moment. Your standard rogue, sorcerer, barbarian, and then they have 2 unique classes, druid and necromancer. I think druid and necromancer are probably the more alluring of the classes because they're more different. I played rogue and had an absolute blast playing rogue. I think rogue was super fun. I played barbarian and I didn't enjoy barbarian as much. And then I played necromancer and I had a great time, and I'm having a great time playing necromancer. I don't know if I personally just don't like barbarian, but I feel my problem with the class is that all these classes have resources you can spend on abilities. And when I'm playing through my rogue, I thought it was great because I like playing burst characters. I'm a Ret Paladin at heart. And I had a great time. And then I sort of realized while playing Barbarian and even Necromancer that it felt like all of the classes and builds were very burst heavy. That when you run out of your resource, you then have to generate that resource back up and then spend it all over again, or be very cooldown reliant. And to me, it felt like because Barbarian doesn't start with 100% Fury, it has to generate its own resource to then spend it. It felt like there was an extra step in that process, which made the class a lot less enjoyable. I had to build up to doing something cool and fun, and then once the cool and fun time was over and everything was on cooldown, I then had to run around and wait before I could build up doing a cool move again. I also wish ultimates were more used. If you're like me, you probably just looked up a build because Diablo is very intimidating and you just copied a bunch of builds. And I played different builds for every class that I leveled, and very few of them involved using ultimates. And when they did, the ultimates never felt good. I think if you have something called an ultimate and it's supposed to be this big, powerful, flashy move, I kind of wish it felt more powerful, and I think that is something that I would recommend that they work on. I do like legendaries. I think legendaries in this game are very cool. They seem very unique and very different and very strong. Legendaries in the fact that you can take the legendary effects out of gear and put it on different pieces of gear, I also think is a really good idea. I will say that putting in a lot of time and effort to get a full legendary build at level 50, and then at level 52, get your first Helltide done, and then all of a sudden you have to switch out all of your gear for non-legendary gear and then spend a bunch of money and resources to make it good again, does not feel good. Speaking of Helltides, Nightmare Dungeons, I think they're all good. This is all post-game stuff that is how you basically generate new gear and equipment. They're similarly like daily quests and dungeon runs, and they're okay as a concept. I think I did it a couple times, and then I realized that I'm not getting a lot more out of the game doing this. I felt pretty fulfilled once I got to level 50 something. Grinding the same stuff over and over again just didn't feel as fun for me. I will say that a big downside for Nightmare Dungeons, which is basically these augmented dungeons that give you better gear and they make the dungeon harder, there's a limited number of those dungeons, and I felt that doing the same handful of dungeons and the handful of dungeon bosses over and over again to be very repetitive and very boring. I can only fight the Den Mother or the Lich guy who summons bone walls so many times. I would have preferred less dungeons, but have the dungeons be better than having 100 dungeons and all of them be kind of bad. If we're only able to have nightmare versions of 30 dungeons, then I'd rather those 30 dungeons all be different and all be fun and not be find 2 objects, put those 2 objects on a rock, and then go fight the wolf guy again. The last thing I'll talk about is the seasons. So the way seasons work in Diablo 4 is that every couple months a season will come out that has a bunch of afflictions and bonuses and different gear and different ways to get new gear. Cool. Great. I like that. Season 0, where there was no season activated, the game came out, and I thought Season 0 was great. I had a fun time playing my rogue, doing nightmare stuff, Helltides, etc. I've had a blast. And then in between Season 0 and Season 1, I didn't play that much, and apparently stuff was nerfed and then maybe buffed. It's very hard to tell. However, I do know they nerfed some aspects of characters, and with the Season 1 enemies that showed up, they have these afflictions on them, these afflictions that increase their defense and HP. Basically, they nerfed character abilities to deal less damage, and they buffed enemies to take less damage and have more health, which made it feel like you were slogging your way through just unimportant NPCs. And I don't think that was a good idea. So I leveled my barbarian through just dungeons, and while that was faster than doing the campaign, it was much more miserable. I personally had a better time leveling up through the campaign. Like I said, you do different dungeons, you fight different bosses. Overall, I felt like I was getting a much more whole experience playing the campaign, and I felt my character becoming better and better, and that my gear was better because you spend more time collecting gear and doing stuff because you level slower than leveling outside of the campaign, where you could be level 30 but the gear you have is from level 15, so you're doing less damage and things don't feel as good. Seasons also offer seasonal rewards, and I felt these season rewards to be pretty underwhelming. I'm not a big battle pass person, so I personally hope that the next season has more interesting rewards or better rewards for people that like doing battle passes. I don't think this season or the concept of seasons is a bad concept. I don't think it's a bad standalone experience, but I also do not see a point in grinding all the way through the battle pass. To me, it sort of feels like there's not enough there. There's not enough incentive to do that. From my experience with Diablo IV, I personally found the most enjoyment of building a character and working on a build. And once I got that build completed and rolling, I played around with it for a couple levels. And then there's nothing really else to do, I could get higher DPS legendaries, but the character's going to be the same. The build isn't going to change. And that's sort of how I viewed Diablo. It was like making a Gundam model kit. The process of building this complex character and adding all of the extra details to make it really my own character was great. And then playing around with it for a little bit, also great. However, once the model is built and it's done, you pose it, you put it on a shelf, you walk away. Once my character was built, I tested it out. I had a good time testing it out. There wasn't too much more for me to do that I personally felt like I got a lot of enjoyment out of. Overall, I thought Diablo IV was a very good experience. I certainly don't play a video game 3 times if I don't like it. I will probably play a little bit more this season or until my hardcore character dies. And I will most likely try out the next season and hope that the afflictions are a little bit more engaging and maybe they add a little bit more incentive to do a battle pass. I do think the Diablo IV campaign is good. I think the mechanics are fun and enjoyable. I do wish maybe they got a little bit more diverse in how classes operate, maybe not make it so cooldown based for most builds of most classes. And hopefully they can add a few more bosses or dungeons to the nightmare pool that make it more distinguished and not feel so repetitive. In the end, I had a really good time with Diablo, and they have a lot of opportunities to improve the experience for other people, and I hope they do that.